Welcome to this episode of Gideon's War on Crunch. We will be exploring some interesting topics today. I have Jamie Ryder on. He is a copywriter who uses philosophy to help startups, founders, and SMEs share their philosophy so they can connect with customers and increase sales. Is that about right, Jamie?
Indeed, that is about right, Kevin. Thanks a lot for being on the podcast today with me. I'm really interested to dive into some different strands of philosophical thought, and we'll see where it takes us.
Great. And so you are really focusing around stoicism and how you can use that for storytelling. And I guess it's a nice segue for me because philosophy is in a way to have values wrapped around in a storytelling format that allows you to live up to certain aspects of your life. So, what would you just openly want to share? What do you have in mind to what you want to talk about? Because I just want to throw the ball over to you straight away instead of me talking.
Yeah, very happy to. And I think the important thing around Stoicism to begin with is just to know what we actually mean by that, because it is quite a confusing term. And certainly I thought it was quite confusing when I first came across it, because from a British standpoint, when we think of the initial character trait of being stoic, it is about keeping a stiff upper lip and actually just being emotionless, or, that antiquated idea of just not dealing with your emotions. And when I was younger, I was certainly guilty of doing that. But particularly over the pandemic, that's when I had to recalibrate around a lot of things. And that's when I came across the big S version of Stoicism, the philosophy. And what I love about that distinction is it's the complete opposite. In the philosophy, it's about actually regulating your emotions, yes, but registering them and actually just moving through them as you can, but also being a part of the community, trying to uplift each other and living by these four principles of justice, wisdom, temperance, and courage. And I think those four principles around the point of values that you mentioned is there's so many ways we can look at that and how we can try to live about those four principles throughout our daily lives, no matter what industries we're in.
Mm. How do you practically apply those four virtues to your own life?
There's a lot of different ways that I can look at this, really, and I think what I like about Stoicism in particular is it's very practical, and the exercises are very simple because you can use it either from a mental health point of view, or you can look at things a bit more objectively if you're going through your day to day. And an exercise that I like to use in particular is called the view from above, which essentially is trying to take a step outside of yourself and just to look at things from a much more objective standpoint. So you might say that you're having quite an anxious day, you're burning out, you're quite stressful. That is all valid, but if you're trying just to take a step back from that, you might imagine just looking down at yourself to begin with, then taking a step further by imagining that there's people in your city or your area who are probably going through the same kind of things, and that puts you on their level. But then you'll
Mm.
go a step further by imagining you're looking down at the entire world and you're connected by this wider strand of humanity. And because we're all going through our battles day to day, but that exercise just really does bring you back down to earth, at least in my opinion. And then once you've realised that, you can slowly come back down into yourself. And then hopefully by the time you've done that mental work, you can see that what you were feeling probably wasn't as bad in the grand scheme of things, or you've at least had a little time to yourself to reflect and then try to do things a little differently. Another Stoic exercise that I like to use is called premeditation of adversity, which is to rehearse for stressful situations in case the outcome is undetermined. Because I think whatever we do in life, there will be a certain amount of uncertainty there. But if you actually take the time to think about, oh, I've got this particular situation coming up, then what would I do if this happened? So it's rehearsing that over and over in your mind, not
Mm.
with the outcome in mind, because that is always uncertain. But if you've got a way to mute that uncertainty or anxiety inside yourself, then that is what that premeditation of adversity teaches. And if you try to blend it with that view from above exercise, I think that's quite a powerful way just to completely put yourself on a certain level and just try to be a bit more resilient day to day.
Okay, so let me attempt to summarize what you've just shared with us. So, in a way, when you're getting anxious or when you have overwhelming feeling, acknowledge them, but then start to zoom out and almost have a practical empathy for the world around you that puts things into perspective, and in order to kind of gets outside of your own bubble and then slowly come back in and review the things that you have acknowledged in the beginning, the feelings that were overwhelming, to see if it has done something. Is that
Absolutely.
that's the first one?
Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely, and that is a wider. I should just say that is like the wider thread of Stoicism. Anyway, it is really coming down to that idea of only controlling what you can control, but then
Mm.
also being engaged in what you're doing because you can step back. But Stoicism also teaches that you do need to be engaged in your communities or trying to create some kind of change within yourself or in your workspace or in your personal life.
Okay. And then the other one would be adversity.
Indeed.
Okay. And what I'm hearing you say is that you're almost familiarizing yourself with the adverse effects of stressful situations in a way until it doesn't become as overwhelming anymore.
Yeah, so you can look at it as like stress inoculation. You expose yourself bit by bit to an imagined scenario, and then by the time you might be in that scenario, mentally you're probably a lot better to deal with it, and then you can just find ways to, cultivate that inner sense of calm just to get through that situation.
Cool. That kind of reminds me of taking an ice bath in a way, right? Because you're in the beginning, the first time you do it, it's very stressful and you almost can't catch your breath. But over time, you're starting to getting familiar with the stressors. And so it doesn't get as overwhelming anymore. And I think that kind of trickles over to if you're doing this in a real life scenario with something that stresses you, then that over time, you will also become adapted to that stressor and therefore get more resilient. Is that correct?
Indeed, and what I also like about Stoicism is it's the simplest thing to understand in the world, but paradoxically, it's also quite complex. So, what I've just given there is like a very surface level look at Stoicism, where you've got that
Hmm.
practicality, but the importance of it comes from doing it day by day and looking at these principles and trying to figure it out in your own way, because Stoicism was not what it was today going all the way
Hmm.
back to when it was first created in ancient Greece. There was a few differences there, but it's evolved as we've gone along. And I suppose that's what I love about philosophy generally. We can always interpret it in our own way if we're trying to understand the world or ourselves in new ways as well.
Cool. Do you have any studies or anything that, as you're saying, it's transforming, right? So I'm guessing there's also some university work being done around Stoicism and the practical things. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, Tim LeBron is doing some work on that over in UK as well, right?
Yeah, oh yeah, I've met him a couple of times. He's a really good guy. But yeah, it's interesting. There seems to be like this renaissance of like practical philosophy, and Stoicism is certainly at the forefront because I learned about it through Brian Holiday, as a lot of people have through the
Mm.
Daily Stoic. But in the
Yeah.
UK, you've got a really big thriving Stoic scene. You've got the Aurelius Foundation, which is based on Marcus Aurelius, and as a
Mm.
non-profit, is trying to bring Stoicism into business. You've got Stoic Care as well, which is a charity that is aimed at caregivers and trying to look at it from a feminine perspective, but also just from that wider
Cool.
mental health perspective as well. So I think we are in a bit of a golden era at the moment where people are trying to bring it in from a values perspective, but also trying to bring it down to earth at the same time.
Definitely. I even try to use as much as I don't have as much knowledge as I would want to, but I'm attempting to use some of the principles that I've learned through reading Seneca, through reading Marcus Aurelius in a way that have helped me tremendously. And also in order for it to kind of create a little bit of urgency in the way that I behave and how I show up to the world. Um, you said before we jumped on, you talked about you being a gamer and hence also why you were interested on coming on. Maybe you want to share the connection that you've started to draw between the two worlds.
Yeah, indeed. I can get really nerdy about this question, but I've gamed from when I was very young. Like, I love just going into different worlds, just doing these stories. Like, it's always amazed me how game developers and these companies can create these really diverse worlds. And from a philosophical aspect, a gaming character that I really appreciate is Geralt of Rivia from the Witcher series. And I
Mm.
think there's a great crossover that you can make between Geralt and Stoicism generally, because the way I look at that in the Witcher world, witches are meant to be these emotionless killing machines who don't feel their emotions and they're ostracized from society. So you can look
Mm,
at that from like the little s stoicism of people just thinking, oh, the robots, they don't feel their emotions, but it's actually the opposite, where you look at a character like Geralt, who is a deeply philosophical man. He tries to do his best in the world. One of my favorite quotes from him is, if I had the decision to choose between evil or a lesser evil, then I'd rather not choose at all. And to me, that sums up a great part of Stoicism where, we can only control what we can control, but there's neither good
mm,
or evil, particularly in the Stoic lens. We have to
mm.
find our own path. And if people want to learn more about Stoicism from that gaming perspective, I would highly recommend looking more into The Witcher for what you can learn, or if you want to watch the Netflix series as well. I think Henry Cavill has done a great job of trying to capture the complexity of that character on a bigger screen and trying to bring his own interpretation in as a gamer himself.
Cool. Is there any other games that you've played and drawn some conclusions from?
Oh, there's so many, but another one that comes off the top of my head is the Red Dead series, because I think, to me as well, that is quite a chaotic world where these characters are just trying to survive, particularly like Arthur Morgan. I loved his character in terms of the amount of choices he has to make, and
Mm,
I think, well, in my opinion, there is a certain undercurrent of philosophy in how his personal philosophy changes, because he starts out as an outlaw who's on the edge of the Wild West. Their way of life is coming to an end, but as the player, you can choose to make him really reassess his values, and by the end of that particular play path, then he becomes a far more honourable man, and he dies to stand for something, which is to help his friends escape and live a life that they want to live. So
mm.
that idea of trying to challenge perceptions or how values can change over time, I think that is a very resonant thing that you can see with a lot of famous gaming characters of these big RPMGs where choices and values matter step by step as you play these games.
That's really cool. And I guess this is a little off topic, but nonetheless I want to pursue this topic in terms of creating games in the future. Someone would be listening and they're looking to bring some philosophy or some sort of aspect to it that maybe might lead the player to reflect or to give the player some resilience in their own life without noticing in an immersive way. What would you say to that individual that's trying to create that game?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And I would look at the bag of Stoic techniques that are out there just to compare. Another one that I particularly like is called contemplating the sage, which really boils down to, you might have a person in your life, whether it's fictional, historical, or somebody nearby you who you really admire. And within
Mm,
Stoicism, the idea of the sage is somebody who's completely enlightened and never gets angry. Now, yeah, that's great on paper, but nobody will ever exist in the history of the world like that. But that's not the point. The idea is you just have to model their behavior and behaviors that you admire and you can take from. So a
mm,
game developer trying to do that, you could model the behaviors of other developers that you like, or you might try to model the behavior of certain characters or protagonists that you admire and you played. So you could try to transmute their traits into like a compelling world or characters. So that is something that I would always recommend from that strand.
great. Now, as you might know, even as a player, we have the sense that, or we have the kind of idea of how the world of the game developers work. It's a very stressful environment. There's delivery pressures, there's pressure of creating and very immersive experiences, and so many moving parts. And keeping a good resilient mindset is crucial for you to be able to perform as a game developer and having a long career. And it takes a toll, and the emotional roller coaster is just there. What are practical advice that you would want to share with those individuals? What are some steps that they could take? Maybe a smaller habit forming plan that they could put into place in order for them to slowly transition into something that is more sustainable in a way if they're struggling.
Yeah, and that was a very valid point, and it might sound quite simple, but it is just to like take some time and actually journal and write down your thoughts. Because if I look at somebody like Marcus Aurelius with his meditations, all he did was write to himself over and over, and 2,000 years later, we're still reading this book, and just as a man's personal thoughts about himself and everything that he struggled with. Never
Mm.
underestimate the power of just writing to yourself. I mean, I remember back over the pandemic, I journaled 3 points that I found positive for my day to day, and it didn't really matter what it was, but that just helped me shift my thoughts just ever so slightly in a better direction. And the
Mm.
more you do it, the more you can actually look forward to it, and then you might look back like 3 or 4 months later and say, I was here now, but look at where I am now. So that is a great first step I would take. But I also want to mention that obviously different studios have their own practices, but I think there needs to be a certain level of accountability from everybody involved, because if you are a developer who knows something is going on and you feel like you can actually put this forward to people, then I would always say, like, look, people are trying to do their best here, but we need to push back a bit, but also trying to bring in like values from, particularly from a mental health perspective. It needs to come from the top down all the way to the bottom, and it's people that need to have these open conversations as much as possible, but also look at it from positive sides as well, because I think well-being is quite an open topic, and I think a lot of the rhetoric and the messaging is about like how mental health and burnout is all there, but there are also certain positive aspects of wellness as well. You might want to say, like, guys, if you generally have like a good day today, you might want to celebrate those little ones as well. So I think there needs to be a balance there between actually trying to address the problem, but also not just making it all about the bad things. There are good things going on as well that might not necessarily be noticed.
Okay, let me unpack some of the things that you said. So I've heard you say you use journaling um, as a way to reflect and to write yourself. And you're saying that do not underestimate the power of having a moment to yourself and reflect upon whatever comes to mind, the day, the emotions, or just positive things, which is gratitude. And there's some amazing studies out of Harvard that show that having a gratitude habit, doing it once daily, does shift your mind into a positive state. We are at a disadvantage to have a more negative connotation and more negative lean, and that's something that we have for survival. So this is what I hear you say as well. Actively pursue positive events that have occurred, that have actually occurred, in order for you to shift to something positive. I've also heard you say that in order for it to change, there are some steps that you would need to take from above. Is this managers and leadership positions, executives coming down and looking what's going on there? Or is it team leaders? Who are we talking about here? Who would you say would need to take a step, and what would it be?
Yeah, so on that strand of thought, I think it needs to start with the CEOs and everybody who is in charge, because the idea is you always should lead by example if you are really committed to that path of trying to bring in more wellness or more mental health positivity. And then if you start building up from the senior leadership down to the managers and down to people from the bottom, then you can start to have these open conversations as well. And I think that is the key thing, simply is just starting to have these open conversations and these safe spaces where people don't feel like they're under the, what's the word, like they need to feel pressurized to talk about these things when they don't want to talk about. And every business will have their own idea of how they do that. But if you just focus on that open conversation idea, I think there is so much possibility there.
Hmm. And how would you foster the culture of open conversation? How would you start to unpack that?
Yeah, so, well, again, British culture being what it is, there's a very like hard nuance of saying, how are you? All right. So when we are saying how are you, we'll just say, yeah, we're fine, but we might want to ask again, no, really, how are you? And then people might want to think a bit deeper. So
Hmm.
bringing in a bit more philosophy, you might want to do something like Socratic questioning, not in a and then like avert way. You might just want to use that model to have open questions where you are genuinely trying to understand that individual on a better level, and then trying to do it with somebody else. So it's that small incremental change. If you try to throw everything at it at once, then it's not just going to work. And I think personally, it is down to that individual level where you start to notice changes around you with other people, and then other people might be more open to sharing that idea as well. So it's that point of small incremental changes and people actually having the same ideas together and then just building slowly.
Okay. So I'm hearing you say Socratic questioning. Could you explain what that exactly is? That just asking open questions and being a good listener, or is there a technique behind this?
At its most basic form, it is just having that ability to have open questioning. And there are a few different ways to look at Socratic questioning, but I find that's the most useful from a mental health standpoint because
Mm.
clearly well-being and everybody's mental health is very, very unique. And it is just having that, creating that space to be able to give that person the opportunity to be open. So I found that Socratic questioning can be good in that perspective, but it might not necessarily be good in another conversation. I think you need to understand that person and their needs and their desires first before you try that.
Mm. Okay. So being aware of the unique concoction of identity that the individual has in a way.
Indeed.
But what you're saying is starting to become aware, asking more questions, and not asking questions just because it's a cultural norm to do so, but rather have genuine interest and then pursue it in a proper way without pressing to kind of foster other people doing the same, and then maybe words of encouragement when they're doing it in order for you to water the flower in a way.
Yeah, that's a lovely analogy. That yeah, it's just like tending that garden step by step, and then just
Mm.
seeing what will come out of it, and then just checking in to see, look, how are you? Would you like to go for a walk, or do you want to, go somewhere where you might feel a bit more comfortable to talk about this or whatever? So there is watering that garden a bit by bit.
Talking about Stoicism, I seem to remember a story, and I can't remember who it was, if it was Marcus Aurelius or if it was a different character, that would once a year go back and live to the absolute minimum. So, not having proper food, not having proper clothing, going out, etc. Is there any, who, for first of all, who was this? And second of all, what value can you draw from that, and what are practical advice would you give an individual based on that?
Yeah, that's an interesting point as well. Like, don't quote me on this, but I believe that might have been Seneca who said that, where because Seneca's quite an interesting case because he wanted to be perceived to be the philosopher that what he tried to be in life through his writings, but paradoxically, he was also one of the richest men in the history of Rome, and he was the personal advisor to Nero, and Nero's reign was obviously not one of the greatest things that ever happened in Rome's history. There was a lot going wrong there, so trying to unpack Seneca's philosophy is fascinating. But what he was trying to say there, I believe, was just trying to maybe once per month or once per year or whatever that is, just trying to take away things like physical riches or trying to give up certain things and actually do some kind of like wealth fasting or just try to see it from somebody who's in a less privileged position. So one way of looking at that could be about voluntary hardship. So just in small doses, trying to expose yourself to that. And I think a lesson that you can learn there is it will make you more self-aware if that's what you choose to do. If you are used to living a certain way and then suddenly you take these away bit by bit, then one, it could
Mm.
make you more grateful just to be, living, breathing in the world and being more aware of your environment. But it would also make you more aware of what's going on in the lives of those people who have to do that day in, day out, and day in, day out, because you've not necessarily had their perspective to begin with, but that might bring you closer to that person, particularly if you know somebody who's like that. So I think there is a lot of practical wisdom in that, depending on how you want to focus on it.
I guess it also helps with shaking up default habits that you have, because you're used to doing things in a certain way with having the right comfort. So if you don't have them, I mean, just leaving out coffee alone can be a headache on its own. Um, there's really value in that. I totally agree. How how are you practicing this? Are you doing this on a regular basis? How are you doing it? What are you leaving out?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I can't really speak to doing voluntary hardship at the moment, but what the other Stoic exercises that really resonate with me are that view from above, the premeditation of adversity, that contemplating the sage as well. And another idea that I love from the philosophy is this idea of memento mori, which means remember you will die. Now,
Mm.
if you first hear that, then you might think like, oh, I don't really like the sound of that. But I can give you a practical example of how Memento Mori really helped me. So my family has a history of muscular dystrophy. It's a genetic condition that started with my grandfather and has gone all the way down to my dad. So I always knew that I would have to get tested at some point. And I remember being quite anxious about that because if I did have it,
Mm.
it would affect, the rest of my family if I chose to have kids in the future.
Yeah.
So building up to that test, I actually wore a Memento Mori medallion around my neck that says, "Remember,
Mm.
you die." So I got the test, but then waiting up to the test for 30 days, I did not take that medallion off. I woke up every morning looking at it and thinking, what would be the worst thing that would happen? Pairing it with that premeditation or adversity exercise, just trying to rehearse if that was the outcome. And then I got to that point, and I'm glad to say that I did not have muscular dystrophy. So that was a
Glad to hear
big
it.
weight off my shoulders. And
Yeah.
but by doing that Memento Mori exercise with the premeditation and adversity, that really helped me to mute the anxiety that was building up. And even if I did have dystrophy, then I still would have done more of that rehearsal to be like, right, I've pondered this for quite a while now, and I know my life is changing. So I'm going to have to, make some adjustments. But to me, that is a practical example of how Memento Mori can work. It is trying
Mm.
to speed up your time to focus on the things that you love doing, because life is temporal at the end of the day. We do have to focus on the things that bring us the most joy. So
Yeah.
that is what Stoicism has taught me. It's to live life more joyously, and just to focus on the things that really get me out of bed in the morning.
So live your passion.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I think that we're not short of in the game development industry. I mean, it's there's almost too much passion, I guess. It's so much passion that they sometimes don't know where to stop or when to stop. I've heard one of my guests. He says sometimes we have to think about forcing them on vacation just to make sure that they're recovering properly. So passion definitely not a shortage, but I guess Memento Mori can also put things in perspective in terms of how you're allocating your time and how you can use it most efficiently. So if mortality in a lens is there, then I guess it's also a way to put things in perspective. Well, if this is what I love and this is what I want to do, um, how can I get the most out of this time? And so I also need to be effective at what I do.
Yeah, but in that case, one of the virtues is self-control. So it's great that you mentioned that idea of too much passion, because I think paradoxically, too much passion can also be dangerous if you neglect your
Mm.
own health as a result of
Mm.
it. So I think looking at that self-restraint principle is so key in Stoicism, because it can
Mm.
help you slow down, and these practices can also be used to make you more focused on where your time is going and how to actually say, yes, I love what I'm
I see.
doing, but I don't ever want to sacrifice my health for the sake of this for no reason, because I need to focus on this purpose, but also take time for myself as well and not get caught up in it.
What is the Stoic perspective on health then? Like, how does that look?
Yeah, that's again, it's a very interesting thing, and I am not the expert on how to explain like the Stoic technicalities, but what I believe it's called is the preferred indifferent, where so nothing is really good or evil, it's just how you can control. But it is always better to be healthy than it is to be sick. It's always preferred to be, physically wealthy than poor if you have that choice. So that idea of the preferred indifferent is quite an interesting concept, and I think health is important in the philosophy anyway, because you need to be healthy to be actively engaged in society. You need to focus on these other principles to actually do good in the world. So yeah, health is a very key part, and maintaining health, because exercise and physical wrestling also comes up a lot in Stoicism. You take like Marcus Aurelius, he loved wrestling as a child. There was also Epictetus, who speaks a lot about exercise and the importance of having physical models that you can look at, and how you can portray your health within those lenses as well.
So you still wrestle?
Well, here's a funny story actually. Before I was a writer, I had two choices for myself. either I would be a writer or a wrestler. So what I mean by that is, the professional WWE kind of wrestling where it's like choreographed and you tell stories, and I really loved that as a kid. And I went with being a writer in the end. I did that for 2 years, but what that did teach me was the discipline of physical exercise, taking time to go for a walk, do a bit of a run, or just go to the gym, whatever. And that is something that I would always recommend trying to carve out whatever time you can just to be active, even if it is just going for a walk.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. Physical exercise is also appearing to be one of the best things you can do, both for mental health, but which is more surprising is longevity. So if you want to have a long career or just a long life, exercise is definitely one of the things you should pursue. And I guess it comes in line with the whole connotation of being healthy and keeping yourself. Um, and I guess the passion. If you want to have practical passion, if you're not taking care of your body, you can really effectively do that, both mentally and physically. Are there any things that we haven't talked about that you would like to share about Stoicism that would be helpful, or maybe a question you could pose for some person that's listening to this to step back and have an experience of how practical philosophy can work for them, and then we might unpack it together if you want.
Yeah, absolutely. So a question I just always like asking is genuinely as a human being, like what do you value as an individual? And that is a question that is wide open. So you might look at this from the idea of, I want to stand for mental health or I want to help people. Okay, great. So have you actually asked yourself how you've tried to do that in the past, or any idea of how you'd want to do that in the future? So it is
Mm,
starting with this very top level question, but then just doing a bit that inner work just to really figure out what that means to you. And it might make you uncomfortable sometimes, but I also think that is the important thing. If you are trying to stand for anything, then you do need to get a bit uncomfortable with only knowing what you know and actually seeing things from different perspectives, which has really helped me as I've grown as a person. I've always needed to look at different perspectives and weigh them up for myself, and I would always encourage other people to look at other perspectives before they make an informed decision about what they're looking into.
all right. So, what are your values? Was the top question, and then that trickles into all sorts of things. And if we're going back to one of the things you advise to do as well, then do it in a journal, and then share your own thoughts with yourself in a way. So you have two things, which I like to call stacking, right? So then you get the most bang for your buck in a way. Um, let's maybe do it as an exercise. What follow-up questions would you write down? Like if someone would want to grab a notebook right now and do this exercise, what additional questions would you do? So we almost giving the listener a way to do this, pause it, come back if they want, or they can just keep listening to us.
Yeah, great. So I really like this idea of fulfillment stories. And now I didn't coin this term. It's actually a guy called Luke Burgess who's wrote a great book called Wanting, which dives into why we want things. But basically, what he says is human nature is, we're all trying to be fulfilled in something. So if you want a certain value, then let's take being ethical. So you might
Mm,
say, I want to be ethical. Okay. Are there any moments in the past where you've been ethical with people? What have you tried to do? And then ask yourself within that ethical framework, when was the last time I genuinely felt fulfilled doing this? So you can actually write it down to say, right, there was a moment in my childhood where this ethical situation came. I did
mm,
this, I did this, I did this. So these are the actions, write those down. But then try to focus in on what about that situation made you feel the most fulfilled. You could also do
mm,
that with a different value. So you might say, you want to be compassionate, or I try to be compassionate to people. Great. So when were you compassionate last? Maybe it was a recent thing at work, or maybe it was just a personal thing. Write down the situation where you were compassionate and all the actions that you did, but then ask yourself, what made me genuinely feel fulfilled about that? Was it because I got the feeling that that person felt, good about what I did for them, or was it because I felt good? You need
mm.
to interrogate those emotions that might come up. So I think that idea of fulfillment is a really, really important subject there.
Hmm. And almost you're including the view from above there when you're putting the empathetic experience of the other individual on top of that as well.
Mhm.
Cool. Very interesting. Okay. So what aspect or what hardship have you been facing lately? What is unraveling your mind? How are you applying stoicism to your mental health or to a challenge that's coming up in your life? And what is that challenge?
Yeah, well, we're all different, but obviously being self-employed and running a business, that's always going to have a lot of uncertainty around it, particularly from a
Mm,
freelancer perspective, where I knew when I said, right, I'm going to plant my flag in the ground and blend copywriting, marketing, and philosophy together. For me, that became like a 360 degree of self-fulfilling prophecies in the sense that it was positive for me because now that I blend stoicism into what I do day to day, it's like, right, I have to remember these practices just to move forward when things might not be going necessarily in the way that I want them. But then I can also say, look, I can step back now and then just analyze things in a bit of a different way. So that was always the plan, really, was to have a safety net around these types of philosophical thoughts that have always helped me personally. But how can I bring them into different aspects of my life as well? Because chaos will always be there, but as long as you have some kind of routine or something that you can fall back on, I think that is the key thing. And I would also recommend that everything that I've talked about might not necessarily be for you, and that's perfectly fine. It's what works for you, and trying to look at different strands of thought so you can build a routine that ultimately works for you at the end of the day.
hmm. Okay. So you've integrated your values into your new profession, and your new profession of being self-employed is creating challenges that is reinforcing for you to show up the way that you want to show up in the world. And thus you're deepening your knowledge and understanding of the practices that you want to integrate into the business. Is that right?
That's right, yeah. And it comes back to that idea of authenticity as well. And
Mm,
authenticity is its own thing, isn't it? Because some people might say, oh, if I could bottle authenticity, then we'd all be billionaires, wouldn't we? But it's to me, it's about, actually showing up as your authentic self. And if I can encourage other people to embrace their own version of authenticity, whatever that is, then
mm.
personally, I feel very good about that, just so people can be who they are at the end of the day.
That's really good. And I guess, you're saying, well, some of these things that I'm sharing might not be for you because you need to try and test what works for you. Nonetheless, I believe that if someone that's listening has a studio, if they're working on a project, they have some sort of authority over what they're doing. In a way, they're faced with the same problem that they need to bring themselves in and kind of holding themselves accountable and facing the pressures. And what you also said is you need to have the right habits in place in order for you to be able to maintain this. And so I think that's a really good takeaway as well. So creating the habits that work for you and for your unique composition, and then based on that, you'll be hopefully thriving. There's always ups and downs, but it gives you a fallback net and an automatic process to thrive as much as you can given the circumstances that you're in.
Yeah, and it is day by day, small steps just to build new habits that can ultimately propel you forward, or you can fall back into if you just need that, to get back up again.
Awesome. Well, Jamie, thank you for so much for being on. Is there anything else you would like to share with the audience? And then after that, I'm just going to ask you to share how people can find you so they can get in touch if this has resonated with them.
No, the last thing I want to say, Kevin, is it's a great podcast and you're doing a lot of great things for the video game industry. So, again, thank you for having me on and keep doing what you're doing. Keep sharing your philosophy and inspiring others in this industry.
I appreciate so much. Jamie, thank you for being on. Go find him on Stoic Athenaeum. Is that how you say it?
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, both on Instagram. You can find Jamie on LinkedIn as well, connecting with him there, or find his homepage and check out what he's offering if this resonated with you. If you have a game and you really want to push your message in a unique way, I think Jamie would be a good choice for that. All right, thank you so much, and I will hear from you in the next time.